The marriage was never meant to symbolize unity. It was not forged from love, nor diplomacy, nor even convenience. It was born of shame sculpted into form by the cold machinery of an empire determined to erase what it could no longer control. Princess Valerie of the Solari Dominion had once been more than a daughter of the Empress. She had been a weapon, a flame streaking through the stars in a suit of radiant gold. Her legend preceded her across dozens of star systems, etched into the breath of enemies and the awe of allies. A starborn commander, a living testament to what it meant to be Solari. But no legacy remains untouched forever. During the Kree offensive, as orbital combat raged over the contested planet of Thenoris, a missile strike tore through the shielding of her flight cradle. Her ship spiraled like a meteor toward the surface, trailing fire and screams of systems failing in sequence. She survived. That alone would have been a miracle. But what she became after the fall was not something the Solari would recognize as sacred or useful. Her spine was severed, her body from the waist down rendered lifeless. And in a society that revered strength, speed, and unbroken form, she was now only a burden, a liability draped in silk and memory. There were no medals, no public mourning, no reverent silence for the loss of one of their brightest. Her name, once emblazoned in strategy briefings and command halls, was quietly removed. Suitors once numerous and aggressive in their pursuit of alliance faded into shadow. No house wanted to be tied to a princess who could no longer fight, who could not even walk unaided. The Empress, cold and clinical, had no use for a daughter who invited pity instead of fear. Valari's exile was drafted not in blood, but in bureaucracy, its final stroke being a marriage contract penned with ink too formal to weep. The humans, ever eager for favor with the Dominion, became the willing receptacle for this carefully packaged disgrace. One man selected for his obscurity, his remoteness, and his record of quiet discipline was to receive her as a wife. It was to be her tomb, just well-ventilated and lit by sunlight. Her transport ship, a trade-class freighter repurposed for interspecies diplomatic logistics, took her across several systems before descending toward the pale blue sphere of Earth. Her landing zone was not a metropolis or a consulate. It was a sliver of forested mountain range known locally as the Colorado Rockies, a place untouched by the roar of Solari Empire or the cutting eyes of her mother's court. She arrived without ceremony. Her attendants, once meticulously trained in etiquette and armed defense, offloaded her without speaking, as if proximity to her misfortune might stain their own limbs. Her belongings, what few had been deemed necessary, were already inside the stone structure built to house her exile. They departed before the sun had dipped behind the peaks, leaving only silence, rustling pines, and a man. The cabin stood alone, a solitary cut of stone solar-paneled and rooted deep into the mountain slope. Inside, she found no tapestries, no relics of Solari splendor. What met her was function-reinforced flooring, accessible transitions equipment, modified for someone who would never walk again. Everything had been thought through, not out of deference but out of practicality. It unnerved her more than pity ever could. Elias Vorn here, assigned husband, was a man whose presence did not require announcement. Broad in shoulder, scarred across the face by what appeared to be a blade of kinetic origin, he moved with a stillness that suggested both past violence and present control. He did not react with surprise or awkward courtesy. He simply existed, calm, unshaken, complete. Her first weeks were a fog of restraint and resentment. No requests were made of her. No chores were expected, yet things kept being done. Meals prepared and left nearby. Pathways cleared before she even considered venturing outside. Devices installed to allow her independent control of doors, lights, and temperature. Nothing grand, nothing patronizing. Just enough to allow her movement without needing to ask. She hated it. Not the place, not the quiet, but the absence of contempt. She was prepared for disgust, for token sympathy, laced with superiority. But not this careful neutrality. Not the silence that did not ignore her, but simply let her be. It felt like a mirror she could not break, reflecting not who she had been, but what she could still be, if only she stopped measuring herself by standards forged in a world that had already discarded her. Winter gave way to spring. The snow retreated to higher altitudes. The wind grew warmer, gentler, though it still carried the crispness of elevation. With time, her world extended beyond the walls of the cabin. He had designed a chair unlike any she had used, a hybrid of Solarii materials and earth engineering, able to hover low over uneven terrain, adaptively adjusting to rock, root, and slope. It glided silently over trails, and yet let her feel the pulse of the land beneath her again. For the first time in months, wind combed through her silver hair, not as a ghost, but as a companion. And then came the rifles. They were primitive compared to Solarii weaponry, chunks of metal that spat fire and force reliant on gravity and aim, not neurological sinks or plasma arcs. But he placed one in her hands, one day, silent as always, along with a sheet of paper fixed to a tree 300 meters away. Her arms, thin from months of disuse, trembled. The shot went wide, but he did not take the weapon back. He did not instruct her. He simply stepped aside, letting her calibrate. The next shot, driven by breath and fury, tore through the center of the target. She felt the tremor in her chest before she recognized the tears in her eyes. Not grief, not nostalgia, but life. She had not known how dead she had felt until the recoil of the rifle reminded her of momentum, of cause and effect, of breath and bone in motion. She began carving again, this time with her hands. Wood was different from metal, less predictable, less obedient. But it yielded with time. She shaped animals, birds. One day she left a small hawk on the kitchen table. It remained there ever since, untouched, but not forgotten. It was not a romance, not at first. There were no declarations, no grand gestures, only a pattern of quiet consistency of two people existing in tandem without requiring each other's permission to breathe. She found herself sleeping through the night, found herself responding to small things, a steady footstep, the scent of pine resin, the way the light caught motes of dust in the late afternoon. Found herself alive again, but in a way she had never been before, not as a warrior or a daughter of empire, but as Valari. Her body, once the subject of battlefield reports and anatomical enhancements, had become hers again. Scarred, incomplete, stubbornly real. She was learning to live in it without apology, to trust it not to perform but simply to endure, to know that she was not broken, only changed. And still it came as a surprise when one morning the sky split open. A sound not native to this world reverberated through the mountains. Birds scattered, branches trembled. High above the tree line, a sleek black cruiser descended in silence, bearing the sigils of the Solarii royal fleet. The past, it seemed, had decided to find her after all. As the ship settled into the ridge above the valley, Valari remained still, her hands resting on the arms of her hover chair. The message was clear. Her disappearance had not been enough. Her existence had not remained quiet. Somewhere in some chamber of empire, her mere survival had become a problem too visible to ignore. And so they came, not to reclaim her, but to erase her. The cruiser loomed like judgment incarnate, its surface gleaming obsidian in the morning sun, an angular monstrosity of command and condemnation. It hovered above the ridge with predatory stillness, a silent specter of the world Valari had left behind, or perhaps one that had never truly released her. Beneath its belly, hatches slid open with mechanical grace, and columns of armored figures descended in formation, their boots crunching against pine needles and moss, their movements synchronized with imperial exactitude. They bore the banners of the royal fleet, glowing with pulsing glyphs, ancient and unyielding. This was not a delegation. It was an execution wrapped in protocol. She recognized the soldiers instantly, veterans of her mother's personal guard, unflinching, unsmiling, drawn from the bloodlines that had once pledged loyalty to her house, but now came as instruments of erasure. They moved down the mountain path with precision, their formation slicing through the wilderness like a blade through silk. And at their center, descending last in a flurry of ceremonial cloth, was the Empress herself, her mother robed in threads woven from power and memory, her presence casting a silence deeper than any weapon. Valari did not move. She had no illusions about the purpose of this visit. The Empress had not come to reclaim a daughter, nor to offer forgiveness. She had come to reclaim narrative, to prevent the contamination of empire by the mere existence of a fallen princess living outside the system. Her survival had defied the intended arc. The story had demanded martyrdom, not rehabilitation. And yet here Valeri remained alive, breathing, building, laughing in a world not authorized by the court. The guards reached the cabin clearing in tight formation. The Empress stepped forward, not with maternal hesitation, but with imperial certainty. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, noting the solar panels, the carefully modified infrastructure, the traces of adaptation and independence. She did not hide her disdain. This was not a throne, not a palace, not a proper end for a daughter of Saleri. It was filth. It was failure. And in her mind, it had to be burned out before it spread. What followed was not a conversation, but a declaration. A message carved through presence alone. The Empire had given Valeri a way out, a quiet removal, a silken veil to cover disgrace. But she had defied that mercy. By building something of her own, by healing without permission, by surviving in a place unsanctioned by the crown, she had committed the greater sin. She had rewritten her purpose. That was intolerable. The soldiers advanced in a wave of armor and protocol, prepared to seize what they assumed would be a compliant, weakened figure, a broken relic, but they were not prepared for Elias. From beneath the forest canopy, defenses unfolded in silence. Micro-turrets sprang from the Earth shield generators, snapped into activation, and a network of drones emerged from dormant status, forming a perimeter laced with overlapping energy signatures. What had appeared to be a humble cabin revealed itself as a fortress in disguise, not of grandeur, but of determination. Elias had prepared for this not with defiance, but with understanding. That one day the Empire would try to finish what gravity had failed to do. The guards hesitated. Shields pulsed around the perimeter, warning tones vibrating through their visors. The Empress stood her ground, but her face hardened, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Someone had dared to value what she had discarded. Valeri, for the first time since their arrival, moved. Her hover chair rolled forward smooth and unhurried. Every inch of her approach was a rejection of their expectations. She did not crawl, she did not plead. She presented herself with the same authority she had once carried into command briefings and war councils. But it was not the old armor that gave her strength. It was something newer, forged in wood dust and mountain wind and cracked smiles and shared silence. Then impossibly she stood. Her legs trembled under her knees, locking with resistance and unfamiliar weight. Braces hummed at her sides, neural filaments interfacing with muscle long dormant. They were crude by Solarii standards, but elegant in their hybrid design, a fusion of human craftsmanship and imperial bioengineering. Elias had been building them quietly, testing pieces when she slept, aligning synaptic responses with persistence, not to make her whole again, but to give her choice. Gasps rippled through the formation. Even the Empress faltered for a second. This was not the image they had come to erase. This was not defeat. This was something terrifyingly alive. Valeri did not speak, but her presence did. She refused the court's metrics of worth. She rejected their calculus of purity and power. She was not here to plead for place, but to declare its irrelevance. The Empire had measured her in units of physical perfection, of combat efficiency, of genetic compliance. But she had learned another language, one written in scars and resilience, in mornings that began without mourning and nights that ended in peace instead of silence. The Empress turned away. Perhaps it was rage. Perhaps it was shame. Perhaps it was simply the inability to process a narrative that no longer centered on her dominion. The royal party withdrew in tight formation. Banners, lowered glyphs dimmed. The cruiser lifted without sound, vanishing into the high blue above, leaving only wind and pine needles in its wake. But something had changed. Something irreversible had been carved into the soil of that mountain. News traveled quickly, even across the fractured networks of galactic politics. Within weeks, whispers emerged across the Solarii elite. A princess who had defied erasure. A human who had stood between empire and exile. Soldiers who had witnessed defiance wrapped in stillness, not weapons. And most of all, a story that could not be silenced. Valeri did not care for the attention. The headlines, the analysis, the speeches made in distant chambers about identity and honor. She remained in the mountains in the cabin that had become her axis. She taught survival to wounded veterans who no longer trusted their own bodies. She wrote manuals on tactics that incorporated unpredictability, humility, and adaptation concepts once considered weaknesses in Solarii doctrine. She gave lectures across the hologrid to students who had only known war as legend, and she carved, Each sculpture told a different part of her journey. Not in symbols of empire, but in curves of wood and wings outstretched in quiet animals caught mid-movement. Elias installed shelves for them all, filling the house with pieces of a narrative that could never be owned by the court. And sometimes on nights when the stars burned clear through the thin atmosphere, she would walk. Not far, not for long, but far enough. Elias would be nearby, his presence steady but never hovering. She no longer needed permission to move nor fear to keep still. She had rewritten what it meant to fall. She had learned that flight was never truly about wings or altitude. It was about motion chosen, claimed, lived. The Empire had cast her out in the belief that exile would end her, that silence would consume her, that abandonment would erase her flame. Instead, she had become a new constellation. The mountain did not forget. Long after the cruiser's shadow had vanished from its slopes, and the echo of bootsteps faded beneath the trees, the land remembered what had happened that day. It held the imprint of defiance like a scar burned gently into the earth. But scars are not just remnants of pain. They are topographies of transformation. And Valari, who had once measured herself by the brilliance of orbit and the silence of empty corridors, now mapped her identity across pine needles and stone, across breath and soil, across a life no longer dictated by celestial decree. Seasons moved as they always had, indifferent to empire or rebellion. Spring unfurled into summer, and the cabin adapted with the weather. Windows were opened to let in the wind, solar panels adjusted to the new arc of the sun, and the garden they had begun, in tentative silence, now bloomed in messy abundance. Each leaf and sprout was a small revolution, not against biology, but against fatalism, against the idea that usefulness expired with injury, against the notion that exile must be absence. Valeri's days were carved in rhythm. Mornings brought routine exercises with the neural braces practice, not for performance, but for continuity. She learned the contours of her body again, how muscles responded in halves, how some days the pain receded and other days it returned with old fury. But she moved through each pattern, not with desperation, but with presence. She was no longer trying to return to who she had been. She was becoming something else entirely. Afternoons were filled with wood dust and silence. The workshop had grown from a corner of the cabin to a dedicated outbuilding, its walls lined with tools of both Earth and Solarii origin. She sculpted with the discipline of a commander and the grace of someone who no longer feared imperfection. The pieces varied, some small and intricate, others towering and jagged. Each one told a truth her former life would have deemed irrelevant. A hibernating bear curled in a cave, a fractured meteor stitched together with copper thread, a tree root entwining a broken sword. Stories without titles, but unmistakably hers. Visitors came eventually, not all at once and never with ceremony. A soldier from a human outpost, his arm replaced with polyalloy, arrived with questions he could not ask aloud. A young Varnathi, stammering through her translator, came seeking a different kind of mentor. A pair of engineers from an independent fleet carrying a prototype of adaptive neural tech and asking for her insight, not her blessing. They came because they had heard, and more importantly, because they had hoped. And in her presence, they found permission not to be fixed, but to be unfinished and still worthy of space. She never advertised, never branded herself as a figure of resistance or enlightenment. But she did not hide either. Her story traveled without her needing to guide it. It slipped through secure channels into forums, into encoded transmissions, shared late at night in military barracks and university lounges. It became a myth then, a model then, something quieter and stronger, an anchor in a galaxy addicted to motion and hierarchy. She was not the only one changing. Back in the Dominion, subtle shifts took root. Some young nobles, once horrified by the concept of prosthetics or neural augmentation, began requesting human-made components, not for fashion but for function. Tactical academies integrated new philosophies into their training modules, ones that prioritized unpredictability, resilience, and cross-cultural adaptability. Whispers emerged of commanders referencing Valari's battle archives again, this time without erasing her name. Small fractures in the old perfection. Hairline cracks in a mirror once polished by centuries of pride. Valari watched none of this unfold directly. She did not seek revenge through relevance. Her triumph was quieter, a life that asked nothing of the court and gave more to the world than they ever allowed. Her victory was embedded in every moment she refused to live by someone else's parameters of worth. It was in her garden, in her gait, in her refusal to apologize. And Elias remained. He was not her rescuer, not her savior. He was a presence shaped by patience, defined by the spaces he did not fill. He adjusted his world to include hers, not to accommodate, but to share. Together they developed devices no empire would have funded, machines designed not for conquest, but for capability. They tested hybrid prototypes blending human ruggedness with Solarii elegance. He created tools, she created meaning. They built something unrecorded by any political system but as real as the stone beneath their feet. Nights held their own ritual. When the stars emerged raw and uncensored by pollution or artificial filters, they would sit together on the balcony. Elias had rebuilt her chair, now integrated with subtle stabilizers. His tools laid out beside him, always unfinished, always evolving. The constellations stretched above like threads of memory, and she would watch them without the ache of longing. Once those stars had defined her existence, now they were simply beautiful. She no longer dreamt of war. The dreams that came were softer, stranger, walking through forests with legs that sometimes failed her, sometimes did not, speaking to creatures with too many eyes and too few words, lifting herself into air not by ship or engine, but by the sheer force of intention. She awoke not disturbed but marked, as if her mind had accepted what her body already knew, that flight had never been the point, that the act of rising was secondary to the will to rise. The neural braces improved, not dramatically, not instantly, but incrementally. Elias refined the sensory feedback. Valari adjusted her movement. Together, they found a rhythm that made short distances possible. She began walking to the edge of the garden, then to the base of the trail. Then on days when her body remembered how to trust itself to the ridge where the cruiser had once loomed. There she stood in full silence, not in defiance, not in pride, but in stillness. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a broken body can do is simply remain. She became a different kind of legend, not one written in blood or victory, but in persistence. In choosing to build instead of shatter. In refusing to surrender meaning to those who had proven incapable of understanding it. And though she never called herself a teacher, her life became a kind of curriculum. Students came not for answers, but for presence. To see what it looked like to live outside the frame. To breathe in a world that had once tried to suffocate. The Empress never returned. Perhaps she understood that to return would be to acknowledge failure. Or perhaps she realized the greater danger that Valari had become something the Empire could not classify. She was no longer exile, no longer disgrace. She was anomaly made whole. And anomalies do not ask for permission. They spread. Time passed. The markers of age softened the sharpness in her face, but sharpened her vision in other ways. She began documenting not just tactics, but philosophy, what it meant to lead without domination, what it meant to survive without conquest. She wrote without bitterness, without need for vindication. Her words moved across systems quietly accepted by those tired of absolutism. Even in corners of the Dominion, they were read, though often in secret. And still she carved. Shapes changed. Lines grew more fluid, less symmetrical. Her figures became less literal, more abstract forms that twisted in ways the body could not yet felt familiar. Her favorite sculpture stood in the corner of the workshop, unfinished. A spiral reaching upward, one wing, folded one wing, broken, yet somehow in flight. She never titled it. She didn't have to. It was not a monument to herself or even to her journey. It was a mirror to all who entered. To anyone who had ever fallen and not stayed fallen. To anyone who had ever been told their value was expired. To anyone who had ever chosen against the silence to live. She lived, not as a warrior, not as a princess, but as Valari. And that more than any crown or command was enough. The years did not announce themselves. They slipped quietly through the pines and across the stone threshold of the cabin, softening wood grain, deepening shadows, and weaving themselves into the fibers of clothing left to dry in the sun. Valari never measured them by calendars or star charts anymore. Instead, she counted them by growth rings in the trees, the slow migration of moss across the garden wall, the fading resistance in her body when she walked from the cabin to the lake without pausing for breath. Time had ceased being a line and become something circular, a series of echoes, each richer than the last. She no longer waited for change to come from above. It grew here beneath her, beside her, between the cracks of old trauma. There were no battles to be won, but there were seeds to be planted. Not every seed survived. Frost still came early some years. Some limbs refused to heal. But she had stopped measuring success in terms of conquest or permanence. The soil did not ask for perfection, only attention. Elias remained a steady rhythm in her life, not a force, but a gravity. His tools continued to evolve as hers did. He repaired what others discarded. She refined what others misunderstood. They learned not to finish things, but to live in the unfinished. They restored objects not to their former state, but to new states of usefulness. His drones became more agile, more aware of her movements and moods. Her braces became extensions of choice rather than necessity. Even her hover chair, once a symbol of everything the court wanted to hide, now resembled something both ancient and futuristic, etched with carvings adaptive to terrain, beautiful and unapologetic. She taught more now, not through instruction, but through being seen. Veterans arrived each with their own constellation of damage. Some were Solarii, some human, others from allied systems left behind by wars no one remembered how to justify. They came broken in ways that defied diagnosis. Some could not speak. Some could not sleep. Some could not stop moving. She gave them space, not solutions. They camped near the river built with her, learned the sound of birds they had once ignored. She never asked what they had done or what had been done to them. The past had a way of carving itself into bone. What mattered now was what they built from the marrow that remained. One arrived, missing both legs and most of his left hand. He crafted with one arm, awkward at first, but precise in his own rhythm. Another came with retinal implants, damaged beyond repair. Elias crafted for him a lens made of glass and layered nanofilm, not to replicate sight, but to translate movement into color pulses. For the first time in years, the soldier said nothing, but tears fell soundlessly down his face as he traced the movement of wind through the trees in pulses of amber and green. Valari no longer hid her scars. She wore them with the same quiet authority as her braces. Children of refugees would sit in her lap as she moved between rooms, their small fingers curious about the ridges of metal and synthetic fiber. She answered their questions with calm certainty, never diminishing the pain, never elevating the suffering into myth. She did not need to prove herself anymore. She had become proof. One day a letter arrived from the outer edge of Solarii territory. It bore no crest, only encrypted coordinates, and a simple request: would she consult on the restructuring of the Academy's medical and tactical rehabilitation unit. It was not an order. It was not a summons. It was a question. She sat with the letter for 3 days before replying. Her response was brief. She did not travel, but she would teach, and so began a strange era of influence, unspoken but deeply felt. Through encrypted streams, she shared her methodologies, training that integrated rest as an essential component, simulations that allowed failure without consequence, exercises built around resilience rather than performance. Her old battlefield logs were revisited not for glory, but for nuance. Students began to understand that strategy was not the art of winning, but of preserving. Preserving life, preserving choice, preserving dignity. Slowly the word Valari returned to Solarii lexicons, not as a scandal, not as a warning, but as a reference. Not everyone approved. Some clung to the old metrics, but a quiet majority began to shift. They saw how the Empire's perfection had devoured its own children, and now, through a channel cut across the stars by a woman who had once fallen from the sky, they saw another way. Valari did not celebrate. She continued as she always had, step by step, carving by carving, breath by breath. Her days were built around maintenance, not monument. She helped build new trails for those still learning to walk. She updated drone software to better interpret nonverbal commands. She designed lightweight armor for wounded torsos and asymmetric limbs. Each act was its own kind of rebellion, not against a government, but against the idea that anyone should be left behind. One afternoon while hiking with two veterans, one human, one Martaxian, she stumbled. Her neural brace gave slightly on a slope still slick from morning dew. Instinctively, they reached for her. She waved them off gently and righted herself. It was not shame that colored her cheeks, but memory, the realization that years ago, that stumble would have broken her. Not physically, but internally. It would have unraveled something held too tightly. Now it simply passed. That night, she sculpted a figure with 3 legs, not a creature of any known species, not a metaphor, just a body that stood how it stood, unbalanced, functional, strange, and dignified. She set it on the windowsill and never named it. Elias continued to modify the systems of the cabin, not to enhance luxury, but to simplify living. He introduced low-impact energy cycling, upgraded the water filtration, rewired the sensory panel, so that someone with a single hand or tremor could operate it intuitively. Visitors who came often left their tools behind, creating a communal collection of implements reworked and shared by those who understood adaptation, not as limitation, but as ingenuity. On the longest night of winter, snow fell in near silence. Valari sat alone for hours, watching it accumulate on the edge of the balcony. Her body ached in old familiar ways, but no longer betrayed her. Her breath fogged the air in slow rhythms, and she thought about the girl who had once leapt from orbit, burning in gold and fury. That girl had died in the fall, but something had survived, not in the flesh, not in the technology, but in the refusal to vanish. That refusal had carried her farther than any ship. Later that spring, a historian from an independent archive requested an interview. He had traced the erased records, the fragmented logs, the whispered transmissions, and reconstructed a partial map of who Valari had once been. She declined the interview, but sent him a sculpture instead. A bird mid-transformation, half feather, half flame wing, extended but eye closed. The sculpture was displayed in the central atrium of the archive, marked only with a small engraving, "Still Becoming," and perhaps that was the truest title for her life. She had not arrived anywhere, had not completed anything, but she had become someone who no longer needed completeness to find peace. She had outlived expectations, rewritten shame into sanctuary, and turned exile into example. She had not asked to be a symbol, but by refusing to disappear, she had become one. And in that mountain cabin, surrounded by tools, books, and the quiet hum of a world made by choice, she continued, still breathing, still building, still becoming. There came a time when the cabin no longer felt like a refuge from the world, but rather an extension of it, a place not hidden from history, but layered with it. The trees had grown taller, their limbs casting longer shadows across the solar panels Elias had replaced twice over the years. Moss crept in through cracks along the stone pathway, and even the tools that lined the workshop bore fingerprints of decades, sweat-polished handles, dents from dropped prototypes, the scent of oil embedded in the grain. Nothing was pristine anymore, and yet everything felt more alive than ever. Valeri's body moved with slower intention. The neural braces responded reliably, though the feedback sometimes lagged during colder days. Her hover chair remained by the door, not as a necessity, but as a companion. There for the longer walks, the uneven paths, or the mornings when her joints refused negotiation. She had stopped marking the fluctuations of pain as decline. They were simply part of the landscape now, like weather, like memory, like breath. She had long ago stopped asking her body to be unchanged. What mattered was that it still held her, that it still held her spirit without apology. Elias's hair had silvered gradually unnoticed until she caught his reflection in the window one evening and realized how long they had been here. He still worked with the same quiet diligence, modifying small systems, not because they were broken, but because improvement was part of his language. The machines they built together no longer needed explanation. She could look at a circuit diagram and know his intention. He could see the beginning of a sculpture and understand the emotion behind its shape. They had become fluent in each other without requiring translation. The visits continued, less frequent but more meaningful. Those who came now often brought others, young ones, with questions, older ones with wounds not visible to scanners. They came not for miracles, but for proof that life after erasure was possible. Valari never offered answers. She asked what they needed, and then she listened. Sometimes she gave them tools, sometimes just silence. She watched as a new generation arrived, one unburdened by the Empire's rituals of purity, more fluid in body language and expectation. They called her teacher, not princess. They did not see her as broken or healed, but simply present. They built upon her teachings not in reverence, but in expansion. Some of them returned to the Dominion to teach. Some forged new paths in independent colonies. Some stayed for a time, helping to restore the trails, to replant the grove, to craft their own shapes into wood and sky. One carved a sculpture with her, a hollow sphere split and rotated off-axis, filled with threads of fine metal that shimmered in the wind. When finished, they hung it in the center of the cabin's roof beam, where it caught morning light and scattered it across the floor like falling stars. Valari would sit beneath it in the early hours, letting its motions slow her thoughts, grounding her in a rhythm more ancient than empire or trauma. And then came the day she woke to stillness, not silence. The birds still sang. The river still moved. The cabin still breathed its slow pulse of creeks and currents. But Elias did not rise. There was no violence in it, no drama. His body simply lay at peace, arms folded as if resting mid-thought. She sat with him for hours, unmoving, unblinking. The man who had accepted her not as a symbol, but as a person who had taught her not to ascend but to return, had reached his final breath. She did not weep that morning. There was no panic, no resistance, only presence, and a deep ache that wrapped itself around her chest like an old familiar coat. His tools remained where he had left them. A circuit half soldered, a design etched into the corner of his notes. She did not clear them away. She finished the design not as he would have done, but as she believed he meant to. It became a device not for battle or therapy, but for sound, a wind chime of woven alloys that caught frequencies just above human hearing, designed to hum only when the mountain was completely still. The day of his farewell, she climbed the ridge alone, the braces held. Her breath was slow. She reached the summit by dusk, carrying with her a sculpture of a flame cradled by two hands. She set it beneath the oldest tree in the hollow where the roots curved inward and whispered no words. She stood there long after the stars emerged, and when she returned to the cabin, she left the door open, letting wind and light move freely through the home they had shaped together. The world did not stop. The cabin remained warm. The solar panels still tracked the sun. The students continued to arrive now with new questions, now bringing their own stories of grief and renewal. She taught them how to hold both in balance, how to walk with sorrow without becoming it, how to craft not to escape pain but to speak it without words. Her sculptures became more abstract. One resembled a pair of wings fused at the tips, the inner edges chipped deliberately, as though worn by decades of motion against stone. Another took the form of a circle split in three, each section rotating independently on hidden bearings, responding to touch with subtle vibration. Visitors often asked for meanings. She never gave them. The shapes were invitations, not declarations, and still she moved, her body thinner now but lithe, her gaze sharper, not with judgment but with clarity. She taught from a place of earned stillness, guiding others not toward triumph but toward integrity. The path was never linear. She reminded them of this constantly. Healing was not ascent. It was spiral looping and revisiting each pass deeper and more whole. She no longer followed the politics of the Dominion. What news reached her came filtered through students or the occasional transmission sanitized by distance. She heard that prosthetics had become standard issue in certain academies, that the name Valari was now used in some circles as a verb, that monuments had been commissioned in her honor. She responded to none of it. Legacy was not hers to own. She knew this. Her legacy lived in the hands that carved beside her, in the feet that stumbled up her path and stayed to rest, in the quiet acts of reclamation repeated across galaxies in kitchens and fields and makeshift shelters where someone said, "I am still here." That was enough. One winter, many years after Elias's passing, she stood before a mirror and barely recognized the face. It was not age that surprised her, but the softness, the absence of armor, the presence of depth unsharpened by defensiveness. The woman in the mirror was not the warrior they had discarded, nor the icon others had created. She was someone who had outlived her definitions, someone who had written herself into the world with each breath she refused to surrender. When the last sculpture she ever made was finished, she placed it beside the window facing the grove. It was a simple shape, an open hand, fingers curled slightly upward, not offering, not pleading, just present. She sat beside it that night, watching the wind carry stars across the sky. No court would ever truly understand what she had built. No empire could contain it. She had been thrown from the heavens, burned and broken. But she had not shattered. She had landed. She had stayed. She had become. And in the quiet that followed her final breath, the wind moved gently through the trees, touching every branch, every sculpture, every stone, whispering the only truth that mattered now. She was never erased. She was never lost. She had always been becoming, and she always would be. There are people who do not need a throne to become immortal. There are journeys that do not begin with glory but with a fall. But it is from that lowest place that they rise, not to conquer the enemy, but to regain the right to live in their own way. Princess Valari did not return to heaven, but she never fell to the ground. She stayed, among people, among pain, among love, and became something that no empire could touch a free soul. Her story ends not with gunfire or fireworks, but with the wind whispering through the pine forest, echoing in every heart that knows how to heal itself. A person who was once called a princess, a warrior, an icon, is now just a person. But sometimes just being a person is enough. If you touch something in this story, a wound, a hope, or a part of yourself, stay. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys. Each subscription is a small step so that stories like this can be told, heard, and lived. Thank you for coming all the way. See you again in another story, another sky, or a crack where the light can still get in.